Hello everyone, welcome. Today I'm coming to you with a book recommendation video for what I would consider one of my favorite genres. Most of my favorite books are somewhere within this genre. I'm a huge fantasy lover, and while I'm sometimes skeptical about certain romance books, I love fantasy romance. And today I'm going to be recommending to you my all-time favorite fantasy romance books, the best of the best, the creme de la creme of everything that I've read. There's still so much more that I need to read, so this is not a fully definitive list, but it's just of everything that I've read so far. These are my absolute favorites and the ones that I think are 100% worth your time. Before we get into all of the recommendations I want to thank today's sponsor, which is Babbel. If you've ever been interested in learning a new language, Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world. You can start having real-world conversations in a new language in just a matter of a few weeks. I used to take French lessons when I was in high school, but I have not picked it up in a really long time, and while I still remember some things, I really don't remember a lot. And so lately I've been using Babbel to kind of brush up on my French again, because one of my goals is to be able to read a book in a different language. Specifically, one of my all-time favorite books, The Little Prince, is a book I want to be able to read in the original language. Using Babbel has been able to help me regain some of the vocabulary that I've lost and help me pick back up where I'd left off and teach me some new things that I didn't know before. I've been able to relearn some common phrases you may need to use, like l'addition s'il vous plaît, can I have the check please, and even learn some new stuff so that I can tell people in French that I love that book. J'adore ce livre. The lessons are all designed by real language teachers, so it's really approachable. If you're like me and there's a language that you started to learn but kind of put off for a while, Babbel actually has refresher courses for languages as well, and it's been really helpful for me to use those courses in order to kind of get myself back to where I was and see where I'm at now. So if you're interested in learning a new language and you want to try out Babbel for yourself, you can click the link in the description to get 60% off of your subscription. Let me know what language you'd particularly love to learn. Again, a big thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video. But without any further ado, let's get back to the video. I also want to give you all a quick reminder that my film and TV journal, the A Clockwork Reader film and TV journal, is out and available now. You can purchase it. I'll leave all of the links in the description box if you want to get this or the reading journal. Both of them are linked down below to track everything that you've been watching. So yes, don't forget to check this out in the description box below. So the last video I made was a video somewhat kind of on this same topic. I read two of the most popular romantasy books on TikTok and did a review of them to see what my thoughts were, because this is a really popular genre online right now, especially too. I feel like fantasy romance and romantasy is having a really big surge in popularity on TikTok and BookTube and Bookstagram and in the publishing world. So I wanted to try out reading those two popular ones to see what my thoughts were, and that kind of inspired me to make this video, because if you haven't seen it, spoilers, I wasn't really a fan of those two books. But I do know that I really like this genre, and like I mentioned in that video, there is a bit of a distinction between what people consider romantasy and what people consider romantic fantasy or fantasy romance. I feel like people kind of categorize them a little bit differently, but the books that I'm going to be recommending in this video today are specifically what I would consider more fantasy romance or romantic fantasy adjacent. They kind of fall somewhere along the line of that spectrum. They're mostly fantasy books that have a heavy emphasis on romance, so the romance is a very big part of the story, but the fantasy is still somewhat equal to the story. And then a couple of them are books that are more along the lines of a romance book that has some fantasy elements to it. So it's kind of like a mix of the two, but these are the ones that I personally really love, that I personally think that you should all read because they're so good. And if that is what you're looking for, if this fall you want to just sit down with some really good fantasy books with some good romance in them, this list is for you. So let's dive in. So I have a mix of standalones and series here, but the first one I'm going to talk about is actually a series where the final book is coming out, I think actually in just a couple months now, but that is the Once Upon a Broken Heart series by Stephanie Garber. If you want just some pure, imaginative, fun, fairy tale fantasy romance, this is 100% the series for you. I really enjoyed my time reading this. This was one of those things that I read where it was just pure fun the entire time. It's definitely an emotional read at times, and it's angsty and high stakes, but it's everything I really love about YA and YA fantasy. It feels like a really nostalgic series to me. It reminds me a lot of the classic YA fantasy series from the early 2010s, and I just think that it's the perfect read if that's something you're kind of trying to get into, but you don't read very much fantasy, I really think this is a great series to start with. I think that's in part because it's more along the lines of a fairy tale than it is fantasy, and I think that's a bit more approachable for people sometimes who are just kind of getting into fantasy. It follows the story of our main character named Evangeline Fox, who makes a deal with a fate who ends up tricking her, and then the story kind of like goes on from there. So it has a lot of those fairy tale elements about fates and demigods mixed with really beautiful and approachable writing that just makes you completely immersed in this story. I think Stephanie Garber is a great writer. I also really enjoyed Caravel, which I read years ago, but I've only read the first one, so I can't recommend that whole series, but I did enjoy that book as well. I also thought that was fun, but this personally I just thought was so great and exactly what I needed when I read it, so 100% would recommend this series, and I'm so excited for the last book to come out. The next book I have to recommend is a very recent read for me, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Faeries. This book was so much fun. If you were anything like me and were a super mega fan of the Spiderwick Chronicles as a kid, do yourself a favor and pick this up, because that is exactly what reading this felt like to me, except like the adult version of it. The story follows our main character named Emily Wilde, who is a professor and scholar who is trying to write the first encyclopedia of fairies, if the title didn't make that clear enough. But basically she's going into the field to research fae and fairies, and she's just collecting information and data on them, and this book basically reads as her entries for the research that she's doing for this encyclopedia. Like I said, if you were super into the Spiderwick books, this reminds me of the Spiderwick Field Guide in a lot of ways, which I've mentioned this multiple times on my channel before, but that book was like my Bible as a child. I truly like believed in so much of that stuff as a kid. So reading this was so fantastic. It also has a wonderful romance in it as well, which is one of the major components of the story, I would argue. I believe it's going to be a series. I know there's going to be a second book. I don't know how long it's going to be, but this does leave off on a pretty big cliffhanger. So I'm very excited for the next book, and it was just so fun to read. It's really well written. It's really engaging. I read it so fast because I was just completely engrossed in this story and I didn't want to put it down, and I just can't recommend it enough. So highly recommend checking this one out. Okay, next up I have a duology that I finished this year and I've mentioned a few times on my channel now, and that is the River Enchanted series by Rebecca Ross. This series takes place in a Scottish-inspired fantasy world. I'm pretty sure we get 4 main points of view in this book, or at least throughout the whole series, and we have 2 main couples that we're following throughout the story. So there's a lot of romance in this series, and I also just think it's still really good fantasy. The plot is interesting. It's definitely, I would say, more romance heavy than plot heavy. Like, the plot is still there, but you're kind of just reading for the vibes of the plot and you're reading more for the romance. So if that's more of your thing, then you might enjoy this one a bit more. But I really enjoyed this series. I think it's a perfect series to read during the fall especially. So yeah, would highly recommend checking this out too. Keeping on theme with Rebecca Ross, I cannot make this video and not mention one of the most popular books right now, which is Divine Rivals. This is personally my favorite Rebecca Ross book that I've read so far. I think I've talked about it maybe once or twice now, but this is definitely a book that I think deserves the attention and the hype that it's getting. Like, it's so popular right now, but it's worth it. Like, this one, they're not lying to you. This was actually very good. This book takes place in a world where there is a war between gods, and we follow around these 2 rival journalists who work as war correspondents during this time, and they write these letters back and forth to each other. So it's an epistolary type of novel because there's a lot of letters in it, which if you know me at all, you know I love books like that. Anything that's an epistolary novel, I eat it up. Okay, so that was like check number 1 for me. I knew I was gonna love this, and I knew from the beginning that I was gonna love this. The romantic tension, the banter, the dialogue in this was just so well done. It was so believable. It was so angsty, and I loved it. I am obsessed with this book. It's very good. I'm very excited for the sequel because, again, this is another book that is gonna be in a duology, but it leaves off on like a huge cliffhanger. So that was very upsetting and stressful. So I can't wait to get my hands on the next book because I just know it's gonna tear me apart. But yeah, I highly recommend this. If you like anything kind of rivals to lovers, if that's the type of trope that you're into, I think this is a great book for that. It does it very well. They're not enemies. It's not like that intense, but they're definitely rivals for a bit. And it's such a good time. Like, if you're looking for angst and you're looking for drama and you're looking for like pure heartache and romance, this is the one. Okay, the next book I have to recommend is the only one I don't have a physical copy of because I haven't been able to find one that doesn't have one of those ugly stickers on it that you can't remove, which is genuinely something that keeps me from purchasing books for my collection because I hate when they do that to book covers. Anyway, my pettiness aside, that book is This Is How You Lose the Time War. Now this book is the only one on this list that I would say is a bit more sci-fi than it is fantasy, but it has like a time travel component to it that has a lot of like fantastical elements to it as well. So I feel like you could kind of just put it in this whole category. I don't read much sci-fi in general. I'm more of a fantasy person than sci-fi, but as far as like sci-fi goes, if you want something that leans more into that, this is 100% my recommendation because this book was fantastic. Again, another epistolary novel. If you like reading about two people in love writing angsty, emotional, heartfelt letters bearing their souls to each other, read this because that's what it is and it's phenomenal. This book is about these two women who are time traveling agents on different sides of a time war who end up falling in love with each other. And you really don't need to know anything else about it. Like if that doesn't sell you, I don't know what will. I read that synopsis for the book and I was like, oh, yeah, I'm gonna be obsessed. And I was, because it's actually as good as it sounds. My one and only complaint with this book is that it is too short. It's actually a very short book. You can read it very quickly. I just wanted more because I was that engaged and I liked it that much. So yeah, cannot recommend this book enough, especially if you're more of a sci-fi person. You have to check this out. Okay, next up we have another standalone novel that I read last year for the first time and was one of my favorite books I read last year because this book is just, oh, it's so good. It's so up my alley. It was everything to me and so perfect for me. And that is A Far Wilder Magic by Alison Saft. I really don't have another way to describe this book. I know this is how I describe it every single time I talk about it, but it's just because that's what this is to me. If you're a fan of Roy and Riza from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, you have to read this book because this is quite literally just fan fiction of the two of them. I don't know that it actually is, but to me, that's what it feels like. And 100% I know the author at least likes that series because they've mentioned that that's one of their inspirations for the world of this because there's alchemy in this universe. So I know at the very least, like Alison Saft has watched Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. So that's enough for me. But if you love Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood as much as I do, and specifically Roy and Riza, you must read this book because this is truly like the story of them when they were young. That's basically what it is. And it's such a good time. This is really like one of my most tabbed up books. You really can't see it on camera, but I had such a good time reading this. I think it's severely underrated. Like nobody talks about this book and I feel like more people should because I really think it's a fantastic example of YA fantasy standalone, which you don't find as often in YA, I think. I think it's become more popular in recent years, but standalone fantasy wasn't as big of a thing in YA. And I really love standalones, so I think this is a great example of one, like I said. Definitely think more people should read this because it's just so good. The angst, the yearning, oh, it's just fantastic. Especially if you like Divine Rivals, I really think you should read this because I think they have similar energy in some ways. Okay, so my next recommendation is another one of my most recent reads, and this is just like shot up to the top of my list of favorites. I loved this book. I loved everything about reading it and I just needed to talk about it and it fit perfectly into this recommendation list too. And that is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I am obsessed with this. I feel like when this book came out, I saw it a bit on Instagram and Book Talk, like a little. So that's like how I found out about its existence. But ever since then, I don't hear people talking about it. And more of you should be talking about this book because if you want good romance with smut as well, this is it. Okay, this is the one. This is definitely more of a romance book with fantasy elements than a fantasy book with romance elements because it's urban fantasy compared to high fantasy. So if that's more of your thing, this is probably going to be something you enjoy a bit more than some of the high fantasy recommendations I have. Basically, it follows the story of our main character who is a witch in a world where witches have to hide the fact that they are witches. And she ends up accepting a job as a teacher to teach these 3 young witches about witchcraft. And while she's teaching these kids and she's staying at their home, she meets the librarian who lives there as well, and they have their little romance going on, and it's just so good. The best vibes. I can't emphasize that enough. The best vibes. So cozy, so romantic. I am obsessed with the love interest. That's like not been happening to me a lot recently. Like I don't really care about the love interest a lot of the time, but oh my god, this one got my attention. I actually cared. It was a great time. Okay, everything about reading this book was so much fun, but it's also really emotional too. The found family in this is also phenomenal. And you know how much I love found family. Like this could also be included on a list of books with great found family. Everything about this is everything I want in fantasy, in romance. Oh, please read it. Please read it. I literally ordered a second copy of this book because I needed it in hardcover and I needed the UK copy. It's just that's how much I'm in love with it. And I need you all to be in love with it too, okay? Please do yourselves a favor, go read this book and then thank me later. Okay, moving on. I could not possibly make this list and not include what book you're all probably expecting to be on this list, and maybe one of two books you're expecting to be on this list, because how on earth could I talk about fantasy romance and not talk about The Night Circus? The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, as most of you probably know, has for a very long time been considered my all-time favorite book. I debate saying this now because I've read so much since 2015 or something when I first read this book, and I still love it like just as much. I just don't know what I love more. It's really hard for me to decide and pick like an absolute favorite, but it's always going to be on my list of all-time favorites because this book is exactly everything I love about reading, and it's everything I love about fantasy romance. I know a lot of people say that they don't really care about the romance in this, they don't care about the characters. I'm so sorry, I have to fundamentally disagree with you because I care so much about these characters and care so much about this romance because I just think it's all done so beautifully. This book is extremely popular, so I'm sure you know what it's about, but if you don't, it's about these two rival magicians who are in a competition with one another in this magical circus. So this is another urban fantasy novel, historical urban fantasy, so it's not exactly high fantasy like some of my other recommendations, but it definitely has more magical elements to it than something like the Irregular Society of Witches. And this book is just, in one word, just immersive. This book engages every single one of your senses. You can see and smell and hear the circus while you're reading it because the writing is just so descriptive and so lush and so beautiful. I will say it's definitely a much slower paced book if you're not into slow paced books and books that are more about the characters and more about the vibes than they are about plot. This probably won't be your thing, but I am such a no plot, just vibes girl, so this was bound to be a favorite for me. And if you like anything that's star-crossed rivals to lovers, I think there's a high probability you'll enjoy this if you like the other components of it as well. Like I said, I personally love the romance in this. There's so many scenes from this that I still think about to this day, even though I read this book like 7 years ago, 8 years ago at this point. But yeah, could not possibly make this video without obviously having to mention this absolute masterpiece. And then of course, how could I possibly mention The Night Circus without mentioning The Starless Sea, Erin Morgenstern's other masterpiece, which sometimes I think I like this more, sometimes I think I like The Night Circus more. It's such a hard decision for me to make. Now this book I would say is a little bit different than a lot of the other books that I have on this list because I think this one is less romance heavy. There's definitely still romance in it, but it's mostly that this book just feels extremely romantic to me because it's a story about stories. And if you know me at all, that's like one of my favorite types of books ever. And if you add like romance into that as well, then it's just perfection. And that's why I would also consider The Starless Sea one of my all-time favorite books. Erin Morgenstern just knows how to write, and she knows how to write specifically for me. I don't even want to explain to you what this book is about. I don't think I should. Just know it's a story about stories. If you want to look up more about the synopsis, you can, but I really think it's something you should go into without any preconceived notions, without like knowing a single thing about the plot. Just read it and experience it for yourself. Okay, so next up on the list is another fantasy series. This one's a lot older, a much older YA series that I feel like people don't talk about as much as they really should because it's fantastic. And that is the Graceling series by Kristen Cashore. I believe there are like 5 books or so in this series now. I've only read the first 3. And honestly, you can read each of these books individually. While they are connected to each other, they also work as standalone novels. And personally, I'd have to reread the first 2, but personally, I think my favorite one is actually Graceling. This book follows our main character named Katza, who lives in a world where people have graces, which are essentially just powers, except her grace is that she can kill people. So this makes her not very popular, as you could imagine, and not very well liked. And then the story just kind of goes on from there. I know this is an older book, and that's part of why people don't talk about it as much, but it should be talked about a lot more in my opinion because it's that good. And if this is a genre you like at all, I feel like the Graceling series, at least Graceling, is an absolute must read. Next up on my list, speaking of older fantasy, YA fantasy, I also could not make this video without recommending the book series that is my namesake. There's no way you can talk about fantasy romance, like romantic fantasy books, and not mention the Infernal Devices series. Listen, okay, I know that these books are really old at this point. I know that most of you have probably read them. I know most of you are probably tired of them. Or if you haven't read them, you're like, I'm not gonna read this Cassandra Clare series. Like, it's way too many books. I don't care about this. That's fine, I get it, okay? I need people to understand that there's a reason that people still talk about these, and it's because they're so good. And I'm specifically talking about the Infernal Devices series, just those first 3. Like, if you still haven't read these series, you don't need to read anything else in this series, okay? You don't need to read The Mortal Instruments, you don't need to read The Last Hours, even though I personally did like those. You don't need to read anything else. All you need to read is Clockwork Angel, Clockwork Prince, and Clockwork Princess, because this trilogy is some of the best romantic fantasy out there to this day. Like, I still think about these three and this love triangle, aka the greatest love triangle ever written. I still think about them all the time, and I think I always will. No matter how old I get, I'm gonna be thinking about these three because I don't know what she put in here, but it's drugs, okay? It's drugs, and it hasn't worn off for years. Will, Jem, and Tessa will live in my heart and my soul forever, and I feel like this series is probably what's responsible for this becoming one of my favorite genres. I think it just heavily influenced me as a kid, and I have never been able to get over it, and I don't want to get over it because I love this genre. I'm so glad that I found it, and I found so many great books within it, but I feel like this is the series that, at least for me, is responsible for all of this, and I'm forever grateful to it for that. So there was no way that I could possibly make this video and not include the OG, the one and only. We know her, we love her. We're never getting over her. Okay, next up on my list, we have a book that I now consider an all-time favorite as well, and a book that I feel like made me rediscover how much I truly love this genre, and that is, of course, Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. You all are probably sick of me talking about this book because I've talked about it a lot, I think, at this point, but if you love Studio Ghibli, if you love Howl's Moving Castle in particular, you will love this book. There is nothing else to say. And Howl's Moving Castle, as you all know, is like my all-time favorite movie, one of them at least, and I will read any book that anyone compares to that movie specifically. And I have read the book. I know people are gonna ask me. I've read the book. I don't love the book as much as I love the movie, shockingly. I have to reread it, but I don't love it as much. But if anything is compared to that movie, if any book is ever compared to that movie, I will always want to read it, and most of the time I end up loving it. But this is definitely my favorite one that I've ever seen compared to that movie, because it actually holds up, and it holds up as its own story as well. And it's just such a fantastic, fun, romantic, entertaining read. It's not the most complex world or anything, but it doesn't need to be because that's not the point. But it's another story where you'll fall in love with all of the characters, the whole cast. I just have such a deep, deep love for this book, and I'm so glad that I read it because it really, really did reignite my love for fantasy romance. Okay, and last but not least, I have a duology recommendation that I consider one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. I haven't talked about this for a while, but I still think about this book series all the time because it is so good. And I know it was really, really popular when it first came out, but I feel like nobody talks about it anymore. And I really feel like we should be talking about it again because this is just truly one of the greatest YA fantasy duologies out there. It's so good. And that is, of course, the Strange the Dreamer series by Laini Taylor. I think I've picked this up and talked about it so many times in videos that my hands have like rubbed off the gold foiling on the cover here, which is really sad because I don't think they make this UK hardcover anymore. So yeah, it's a little tragic, but it's okay. This one's definitely a bit more heavy on the fantasy than the romance, but the romance is still a major element to the story as well. Strange the Dreamer is another one of those books where it ticks every single box for me as far as what I like in a fantasy book and just what I like in books in general. It has really great romance in it. It has gods and demigods. It has a magical library. It has ghosts, dream magic, everything you could possibly want. It's all in here. And it also just has such good romance, so much angst, so much yearning. I really just think that we as a society deserve to bring this book series back to mainstream popularity because it deserves it, and we deserve it because it's so good. And they need to make more fantasy series and duologies like this series because it's unlike anything I've ever read, but it's exactly what I want to read all the time. So yeah, this is me trying to reignite the popularity of this series again, because I really think we should. I know it's a bit older, I know it's been out for a while, I know you all read it a long time ago, but I'm like this close to rereading it because I just miss it so much. I miss this world and I love it so much. I need Laini Taylor to write some more fantasy books because you could also include the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series on this list as well. It's just been too long since I've read it, so I don't remember a lot about it, but I remember that series also being pretty romantic as well, and it was also fantastic. I really enjoyed it. But yeah, Strange the Dreamer, oh my god, easily just one of my favorite fantasy books, but also fantastic fantasy romance. But there you all have it. That is it for my recommendations of my all-time favorite fantasy romance books, romantic fantasy books, whatever you would like to call them. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I have not read every single fantasy romance book in existence, okay? There's still so much more that I need to read. I have so many on my list. There are like 3 that I'm in the middle of right now. And honestly, I really feel like I probably forgot something major on this list too, because I know there's more that I really love, but I really tried to pick the books that had the most romance. Like, I could have included like Six of Crows, but I really think that's more of fantasy and has some romance in it. The romance is less of a leading part of that story, even though it's still a major component. I don't consider that fantasy romance as much as I consider a lot of these books fantasy romance. So yeah, I might have missed a couple of things, so let me know if there's anything else that you know I've read that I would probably also have included on this list. And also let me know what books you would include on your list of favorite fantasy romance books and ones you think I should read, because like I said, always looking to read more in this genre. It is one of my absolute favorites, and I will definitely make a part 2 to this video if I read more and you guys want to see more and I have more things to recommend, so be sure to let me know. If you would like to follow me on any of my social media to keep up with what I'm reading and what else I'm doing, all my links are in the description box as always. But thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!